All right, well, here to help us dig in on more on this trial, attorney and legal analyst Misty Marris. Misty, thank you for joining us. It's so good to talk with you. So accused of false written statements, false oral statements, and illegal gun possession, what are the chances the president's son walks away from this unscathed?
Well, it's just too soon to tell what will actually happen at the trial. So right now we're just at the precipice, stepping into that courtroom with jury selection. And when you have a case like this that is centered on documentation, the documents are going to tell a lot of the story. Some things to listen to and to listen for. Once the opening statements take place, and of course that's after jury selection happens, the prosecutors will lay out their case in opening statements. Then the defense has the chance to speak and say their theory of the case, talk about how prosecutors have failed to fulfill their burden. What I think was interesting that Caitlin said is something that we picked up on as far as the defense. It seems that one of the arguments is going to be that there was no falsification of this document because Hunter Biden's state of mind at the time, he did not consider himself an addict. I would expect from that to see expert testimony regarding drug use, a very interesting element to the case that I don't think we initially saw coming because it was largely based on documentary evidence.
Do we think he could face up to 25 years in prison if convicted? Do you think that kind of punishment is likely here?
Well, it's a significant punishment. If he's found guilty, the judge actually has significant discretion. There's what's called there's this thing in the law that says there's standard sentences for different types of crimes. And so the judge doesn't just get to give a sentence of the maximum when the guidelines say differently. So those judicial guidelines will help for the judge to make a determination. 25 years is the higher end. It could be much, much less, especially for somebody who has not been convicted of another crime at the time and something that's based on documentary evidence as opposed to a violent crime. So there's so many factors that come into play. It's unlikely he would see a sentence, if convicted, on that higher end.
What about the other court case, the trial in September? What do we expect to see in that?
That is so much more focused on documentary evidence. It's like the follow the money. And when you're talking about a tax evasion charge, tax evasion is basically there's forms that you have to fill out, there's things that you sign off on, there's money that you didn't claim, and it will be very, very much based on paperwork. It will probably be a little bit of a boring type of trial, only because it's really going to be following those documents. So it's a whole different slew of issues with different types of defenses that are raised, but presumably that case is going to be largely just based on that following the money, following the paperwork.
So what are the chances that Hunter Biden walks away from any of this, either of these cases, either of these trials, unscathed?
Well, the prosecution has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's a really important element of this. The defense does not have to say anything or put on a case. So it's hard to tell from a legal perspective whether or not the prosecutors are actually going to fulfill their burden. We have to see how the cases actually unfold, what the evidence is, and the jury will ultimately weigh the credibility of that evidence and make a determination. But when we talk about the term unscathed, well, maybe legally, he may be acquitted. There may be a hung jury. He may get a lesser included offense as opposed to the most serious level of the crimes. But his reputation is obviously impugned from a public perception. So unscathed is kind of maybe he gets out of the legal consequences, but the other aspect of it will it's going to live with him.
And Misty, you've been busy. You've been all over NewsNation. We appreciate you talking about all of these trials happening right now. There's Hunter Biden coming up. We just got out of former President Donald Trump. What do you think of the appeal here from the defense? What will that look like in his case?
Right. So this was a very, very novel case. So what the prosecutors did was use falsifying business records. That's the actual crime. And in order for that to be elevated to a felony, there had to be what's called a predicate or operative crime. In this case, it was a New York State election law, and that required showing of an unlawful act. And the unlawful acts fell under federal jurisdiction. It was federal campaign finance law, federal tax law. So the actual appeal in this case is going to have a threshold issue of whether or not a federal office, Donald Trump running for president of the United States, whether that candidacy even applies to the New York State election law. So that's going to be a threshold issue on this appeal that's not even going to get into the other issues, which will certainly be raised, which relate to the trial record, whether evidence came in that shouldn't have, that was unduly prejudicial, or whether the defense did not have rulings from the judge that were fair. So all of that will be at stake. But I think that threshold issue of whether or not federal office even applies in the New York State election law, that's something the appeals court is going to have to grapple with.
Do you see this going all the way to the Supreme Court?
It could, but there's a long, long path to the Supreme Court because this is a state case. So it starts off, it's a New York State decision, and then it goes to the appellate division. Then it goes to the Court of Appeals. After the Court of Appeals, there would have to be an application to the federal court system. So you're in the state court system. They could appeal to the federal court system, who could choose to take up the case with establishment of what's called a federal question. So in this particular case, there's a chance that you have that because we're talking about the presidency. We're talking about federal statutes being implicated in a state case where the state does not have jurisdiction over those statutes. So it's absolutely possible, but it is a very long road to get there. And all of the state remedies have to be done before you could even get into the federal court system.
Misty, thank you so much. I see you on our air all the time. I've always wanted to meet you. I really appreciate all of your insight, letting our viewers know what's going on in our country right now. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. And next time in studio.
That's right. Let's do it. We appreciate it.